On June 11th of 1837, Boston discovered that it was a poor idea to mix volunteer firefighters, whiskey, funeral processions, church bells, civic pride, and bricks all in the same afternoon. This revelation came to the city in the usual historical fashion, which is to say, loudly, explosively, and with several men limping home while insisting they had won the fight, saying, "You should see the other guy." Sure. The city that day was hot, crowded, and already carrying enough tension to split a wagon axle. Broad Street sat in one of those rough working neighborhoods where tempers stayed close to the surface and everybody knew exactly who they disliked before ever having a conversation with them. Boston liked to think of itself as civilized. Most places do. But Boston also enjoyed public brawling with an enthusiasm that would have impressed Roman spectators in the gladiator ring. Now, before we get too far into the riot itself, you need to understand the firefighters. Modern people imagine firefighters as these disciplined public servants sliding down the polished poles with their shining helmets in the sun. But in 1837, in Boston specifically, they were more like competitive street militias carrying water buckets and unresolved emotional issues. The city did not yet have a professional fire department. Fire companies were volunteer outfits made up mostly of tough working class Yankee men who treated civic duty like a contact sport. The city paid whichever company arrived first at the blaze, kind of like how ambulances work in the United States for the most part. Naturally, this created a system where the firefighters raced through crowded streets like gamblers chasing that last horse in America. And if more than two companies, or if two companies reached the same fire at the same time, they sometimes fought each other before even getting close to fighting the flames. Nothing encourages professionalism quite like punching another firefighter in the jaw over a burning warehouse and who gets to pour the first bucket of water on it. These companies had reputations. Some were respected, some were feared, and some were apparently one barrel of ale away from becoming pirate crews. On the afternoon of June 11th, Fire Engine Company number 20 was returning from a fire at Boston Neck. Their duties were completed, and several of the men went to a nearby tavern because apparently risking death around collapsing buildings works up quite a thirst. I absolutely believe that. It gets hot. Now, Massachusetts still had blue laws in effect, which means that taverns technically should not have been serving alcohol on a Sunday. There are many states now and many counties within certain states that still have these laws even now. But in human beings, we've always had this way of having a flexible relationship with laws that we find inconvenient. And the tavern served these men anyway. By the time the firefighters came back out onto the street, they were feeling energetic in the same dangerous way a kicked hornet's nest is energetic. At that exact moment, a large Irish funeral procession was making its way down Broad Street. Already this sounds like the beginning of a whole lot of very poor decisions for somebody. Hundreds of mourners were moving solemnly through the street. Families walked together and neighbors followed behind. The atmosphere was, of course, very serious. It was emotional and it was crowded, and most of the firefighters passed through the procession without much incident. But then came George Fay. He was 19 years old and drinking and full of confidence, as a 19-year-old would be, but he was empty of wisdom. And accounts differ on whether he shoved someone, insulted someone, or simply behaved like a man of his age who had recently mistaken alcohol for courage. Whatever happened, fists started flying almost immediately. Firefighters rushed over to help George Fay. The mourners rushed to help their own men. And suddenly Broad Street looked less like Boston and more like the final 10 minutes of civilization. The firefighters got the worst of it in this first exchange. Notice I said first exchange. They were beaten back toward the firehouse by sheer numbers. They were bruised and angry and humiliated, and they retreated inside. But now here's the moment where a wiser man might have said, well, this has gotten to be unpleasant. Let us all go home before someone gets killed. Well, unfortunately, wisdom had apparently taken the day off, or had gone to take a nap or something, because the foreman of the company, a man named W. Miller, completely lost control of the situation. Instead of calming things down, this man ordered the emergency alarm sounded. Well, this was kind of roughly equivalent to trying to settle a family argument by firing a cannon into the dining room. It's a little bit of an overkill, is it not? So the company rolled its engine into the street, ringing its bells. Men were sent to ring church bells across the city. Fire alarms echoed everywhere. Well, other fire companies heard the signals and came racing toward Broad Street, believing that Boston was burning. This is a call to arms. Well, in fairness, Boston was soon burning, just socially. Meanwhile, the funeral procession continued moving down near New Broad Street. Then, another responding fire company arrived a little too fast, their wagon crashing into this crowd and scattering the mourners. Thankfully, their vehicles weren't nearly as fast back then as they are now, especially with them being horse-drawn, so it wasn't quite as bad as it could have been these days. But the Irish crowd believed that this assault was absolutely deliberate. At that point, the riot truly began. Men poured from houses carrying clubs and sticks and bricks and stones and whatever else could injure a fellow citizen cheaply. Firefighters from around Boston joined in the brawl. Protestant laborers rushed in to aid the firefighters. Furious locals flooded into the streets. Within merely minutes, nearly 800 men were actively fighting. And because human beings cannot resist free entertainment, around 10,000 spectators gathered to cheer and scream and contribute absolutely nothing useful except to egg the men on. History happens this way more often than governments like to admit. On newspaper later, it was described that the Broad Street looked like a battlefield. Men staggered through clouds of dust with bleeding heads and torn clothing. Bricks flew through windows, sticks cracked over shoulders, people disappeared beneath the crowds. And somewhere in all of this chaos were ordinary residents simply trying to survive what should have been a quiet Sunday afternoon. But then came the home invasions. This is where the riot stopped pretending to be about honor and become about cruelty. Groups of men smashed into nearby houses occupied by Irish families. Doors were broken down. Furniture was destroyed. Windows were shattered inward. Families were dragged onto the street or beaten where they stood. These people had nothing to do with the funeral procession or the firefighters or the riots or the fights or any of it. One account described feather beds being ripped apart so thoroughly that the feathers blew through Broad Street like a snowstorm. Imagine explaining that to somebody afterward. Oh, how did your house get destroyed? Well, first came the firefighters. The city had no professional police department at the time either. Absolutely none. Boston relied mostly on a city marshal and a handful of night watchmen, which meant when several hundred men decided to all destroy part of the city all at once, there was no organized force capable of stopping them. And even if there had been, most of them probably were in that crowd fighting already anyway. That little detail is important because it reveals how thin the illusion of order really was. People like to imagine that the old American cities were orderly places filled with gentlemen in hats discussing philosophy. In reality, many cities were held together by little more than public habit and mutual exhaustion. Once those simple little binding things broke, everything got primitive very quickly. The riot raged for roughly 3 hours. And I know 3 hours does not sound like a lot when you can sit down and watch a Christopher Nolan movie in a little more than 3 hours. But think about it. If you've ever been in a fight, 5 to 10 seconds feels like a lifetime. 3 hours of a fight? Mayor Samuel Eliot finally realized that the city was running out of options. So he summoned the National Lancers, which was a cavalry unit, along with hundreds of militia members carrying fixed bayonets. This sounds terrifying. This is a sentence which should concern any government. If your city requires cavalry charges to settle your street fight, perhaps your municipality needs a review. The militia arrived from church services because the church bells had been rung in a very specific emergency pattern. It was a signal. Imagine sitting halfway through Sunday worship only to discover that you're now apparently marching into urban warfare when you hear these bells chiming. The sight of armed cavalry and militia, though, finally broke the riots apart. Men scattered. The streets were absolutely wrecked. Broad Street looked like somebody had attempted to reorganize Boston with billy clubs. Miraculously, no immediate deaths were officially recorded, though many men did suffer from severe injuries. Historians do suspect some likely died later on from wounds or from complications. But medical care in 1837 was not exactly reassuring. If a doctor approached you carrying a saw and a little bit of optimism, your odds were mixed and dismal at best. Now here comes the part that nobody saw coming. The Broad Street riot accidentally improved Boston. Nothing motivates reform faster than public embarrassment. City leaders finally realized that their volunteer fire system was dangerously chaotic. 3 months later, Boston established a professional paid fire department. Then came a professional paid police department. In other words, one drunken street riot helped to drag Boston kicking and screaming, literally, into the modern age. That's one of history's favorite little tricks. Civilization often advances because people become exhausted by watching one another behave like escaped livestock. And here's another irony sitting quietly underneath this whole affair. The firefighters involved believed themselves to be the protectors of the city. The mourners believed themselves defending the dignity and community. And the spectators believed that they were just witnessing some excitement for free. Yet by sunset, everybody had helped to create something uglier than whatever insult had started the entire mess in the first place. That's how riots work. They begin with certainty and end with a whole lot of regret. Today, Broad Street is much quieter. The riot serves mostly in old newspaper archives and faded illustrations as nothing but an uncomfortable memory of how quickly ordinary people can lose control when fear, pride, alcohol, and tribal loyalty collide. And perhaps the strangest part of all is how familiar it all still feels. Human nature changes clothing faster than it changes behavior. Give people uniforms and they form rivalries. Give them crowds and they become louder. Give them fear and rumor and enough wounded pride, and suddenly a city that looked civilized at noon can resemble a battlefield before supper. Boston learned that lesson the hard way on June 11th of 1837, but the city also learned another lesson, though it probably did not enjoy hearing. A government cannot simply hope order will maintain itself. Somebody must build systems strong enough to survive human foolishness. Otherwise, one loud bell and one drunk teenager can turn an ordinary afternoon into a history lesson. And in this case, they certainly did. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. I know that you can't do that if you're on most of the podcast platforms. There's a couple that allow you to. If you're on those, definitely use them. But if you're following me on Facebook, if you're on YouTube, you have the ability to leave a comment, and I love your comments. So leave your comment. Do you think cities become stronger because people learn from disasters, or do we simply repeat the same chaos with newer uniforms and better streetlights. I know this one's going to be a little controversial. Go for it. Just keep the foul language to a minimum, if you would. And of course, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page, because I do post these videos every single day. And I'll be doing another one again tomorrow. I don't know what it's going to be, but it'll be fun, I promise. And subscribe to the podcast pretty much anywhere that you can get a podcast, if you follow podcasts at all, because you never know what's going to come up in this day in history. And I don't want you to miss an episode. Every subscriber helps. You're helping other people to see the history every time you interact with the videos. So thank you for watching.